everyone should give a response to that. How do they found about the session today? And that survey is very much very good input for Brother Gate and his team to improve whatever that they can do and to give them a good feedback of the session that we are having today. Brother Gate is not a stranger to our community, the Indonesian Muslim community of Victoria. He was the president of ICV back in 2014, 2015. He had run session at our center here in Baitul Ma'mur, in Surau Kita in Coburg, as well as in Masjid Westol in the southeast. So Alhamdulillah, without further ado, I would hand over the mic to Brother Gate to start our workshop for today. Inshallah, it will be fruitful, it will be beneficial to all of us. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Jazakallah khairan, brother. Everyone can hear me okay? Those who are on Zoom, I've got my computer in front of me, so if you have a... Closer? Is that better? Okay. Oh, let's see how we go, inshallah. Can you hear me all right now? Yeah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm just saying that those who are on Zoom, if you have a question or you want to raise something during the session, please just put it in the chat and I'll try and get to it. We've only got a few hours today, inshallah. So it's essentially a half-day workshop, and we do these workshops of various length. So the slides I've got up, I'm not going to go through all of those slides. That would take us pretty much all day. So I might just go through some of those slides a little bit quicker than otherwise. But really, it's an important thing for us as we're going through. If there's issues, let's talk about them, right? So whatever's most important to you, we might do those in a little bit more detail than other things. But we'll just get into it, inshallah. Bismillah. All right. Let me just get myself. All right, so these are the sort of topics that we're going to cover. Increasing our awareness and understanding of, so what FD and SV stands for is family, domestic and sexual violence. So in a general sense, so the purpose of these workshops are really three things. One, to help our own community understand this issue better in terms of what the Western community talks about, right? So what's the mainstream view on these issues, so that when we're out there and we're talking about it, we at least know what they think on these issues. And because a big part of their position on family domestic violence is around gender and gender stereotypes and gender roles, which Islam takes a different approach on, right? So we're very clear around what Islam says on the issue of gender and gender roles, which is different to theirs, right? So when I'm talking about these issues publicly, it's one of the issues that we have very robust discussions with mainstream on, right? So, but this is to help you understand what do they think on these issues. And so we'll go through their ideas around gender and how it impacts on family domestic violence. We'll go through the different types of violence and what leads to violence. What are the factors that cause violence to occur? And I want to have a conversation about leadership. Because it's a very important one, because one of the main things around violence from a Western perspective is the issue of control. So men want to be in control, and when a woman stands up for herself, men get violent. That's one of the positions they take, which has a lot of merit to it. It's a valid position. Islam says, in terms of the family, the man is the leader of the household. But what does it mean to be a leader, right? So we want to have a conversation about what leadership really is. And then we'll go through some principles from an Islamic perspective. So what does Islam actually say about how we respond to issues of domestic violence? So as a family unit, and most of my discussion is actually going to be aimed at the brothers. So it's good for the sisters to hear what I say to the brothers in our community, right? Because yes, some violence occurs by women, right? But the overwhelming majority of violence is men. Men causing violence to women, men causing violence to other men. So I hear people say all the time, yeah, but women do it. Yeah, yes, women do it. There's no question about it. Women do it. but we don't talk about the 1% and ignore the 99%. Let's deal with the 99% first, and then we worry about the 1% after, right? And then I want to go through, if we have time, some scenarios where we can just add a practical example, talk about some of this stuff, and this issue of masculinity. Because this issue of what it means to be a man is under attack from a Western perspective, and we, from our own community perspective, losing the way a little bit about what it means to be a man between what the West says men should be, what Islam says men should be. We get lost a little bit. So if we have time, we'll try and get through most of that, inshallah. All right. I'm going to go through these. Let's just go straight into this. So what is family, domestic and sexual violence? So, family, domestic and sexual violence, first of all, it's a crime, right? So in Australia, it is actually a crime to commit family, domestic and sexual violence. It's when there is violent, abusive or bullying behaviour or actions towards a partner or former partner to scare and control them, right? It can happen in the home, outside the home. It causes fear and harm to the body, mind and spirit, okay? Now, family, domestic and sexual violence happens to anyone and anywhere. It's no bigger a problem within religious communities to non-religious communities. It is no bigger a problem for our community than any other community, right? So I don't want anybody thinking the reason why we're doing this is because our community has a problem with domestic violence. Our community doesn't have a bigger problem with domestic violence than any other part of the Australian society. The reason why we're doing these is we're saying to the government and to the non-Muslims that if we want to solve domestic violence within our community, it has to come from an Islamic perspective. You can't come into the Muslim community and use your words, your concepts, and get the community to deal with this issue. It has to come from within Islam to deal with it from an Islamic perspective. So while the problem is the same, the solution for us has to be different. It happens across all age groups, doesn't matter whether it's wealthy or poor. You know, there's a myth out there that it only happens in poor communities or uneducated communities. It is so far from the truth. Right? It happens across all classes, doesn't matter where it is. Really, at the end of the day, the only common factor on this issue is around men wanting to be in control and not understanding what it is to actually be a man any longer. That's really the main issue. So it's just some more definitions. So violence against women is any act of gender-based violence that is specifically directed against a woman or affects them disproportionately. So these are from the mainstream. This is what Australian government and the Australian society says are violence. And family violence is a broad term referring to violence between family members as well as violence between intimate partners or ex-partners, right? I'll go through some of the statistics a little bit later, but just keep in mind that a woman in Australia is killed by a partner or former partner once a week on average, right? So it's a huge problem across all of society, yeah? Intimate partner violence is any behaviour by a man or a woman within an intimate relationship, right? So from our context, that's marriage, right? That causes physical, sexual or psychological harm to those in the relationship, right? This is the most common form of violence against women. So just some stats. So 1 in 3 women experience physical or sexual violence or both perpetrated by someone they know. So during her lifetime, 1/3 of women will experience some form of violence, physical or sexual violence. Of those, more than half will have children in their care when the violence occurs. So it doesn't just impact the woman, right? It impacts the children. So this is where we start to get into issues around generational trauma, right? We don't understand the long-term impact that this behaviour has, all right? Domestic and family violence is a factor in about 40% of all murders in this country, right? So, and it's not getting any better, despite all of the effort, all of the media, all of the money government has thrown at it. It really hasn't improved much at all. And as I said, at least 1 woman a week is killed by a partner or former partner in Australia. So up until the end of August, so we're only 2/3 of the way through the year, 54 women and children have been killed as a result of domestic violence in Australia, right? Domestic and family violence against women is the biggest reason women are homeless, right? Because the only way at the moment a woman can escape violence is for her to leave the home, right? But that's not easy, right? So people often ask, well, why doesn't she leave? When we go through some of the different ways violence occurs, you'll get a better understanding about why that happens. Around Australia, police tend to call out about domestic and family violence on average once every 2 minutes. So in the, I don't know, 10 minutes we've been going right now, somewhere in Australia, there have been 5 instances of the police being called on average to deal with domestic violence. Okay. Is any of that a surprise to anybody? I'm going to leave my screen this way, just so that I can just check if there's anything coming through the chat, that's all. Yeah, no. Yeah, is any of that a surprise to anybody? Surprised? Which part of it surprises you? Just the sheer number? One woman killed every week. Yeah, yeah. So that's the problem, right? And that's why we want to try and solve it, yeah? In the last month, hasn't been anything in Victoria, but 2 Muslim women have died in New South Wales and Sydney as well as domestic violence. Both of them could have been prevented in the sense that that their cases were known to both police and others, and yet the system failed them. Okay. So I just want to play this little video. So again, this is coming from an organisation called Our Watch. So Our Watch is a semi-government authority. So it's the main way the government deals with family violence nationally. So this is again, I'm presenting now what mainstream Australian society is talking about, right? So you don't have to agree with necessarily everything that's in here, but it's good for people to know. Yeah. So let's just see if I can play this.
Every 2 minutes, in fact. A story that happens 657 times a day, every day of the year, and in every kind of household, and every city and region across Australia. This is the biggest story behind violence against women. This story doesn't happen because this is the story of gender inequality that contributes to the murder of 1 Australian woman almost every week. Sounds like a tall tale, right? Let's take things back to the start. Here's the story of a regular woman. As a girl, she gets told how pretty she is, never how clever she is. That if she wears a short dress, she's asking for it. She grows up and gets used to being harassed by men on the street. That's just the way it is. It's the story of a regular man. As a boy, he learns that women aren't equal to men from a very early age. Even though both his parents work, on the weekends, his mum does the housework. Well, when he cries about being bullied at school, his dad tells him to stop being such a girl and just punch him right back. Technically speaking, we'd say that these social norms, practices, and structures have shaped both the boy and the girl, creating a society where less and men are expected. Such a world, disrespect and hostility is excused, and violence against women is far more likely. But back to our story. The girl grows up into a woman, the boy grows into a man, and they begin to date. He jokes that he hopes she doesn't get fat now that we're together. She's not sure whether she should laugh. They have the same education and do similar work, yet he earns more money. He's quickly promoted, like other men in the company, while at home she does all the household chores, and he takes control of their joint finances, seeing as he's the main breadwinner. When they're at the pub, he puts her down in front of his mates. His friends stay quiet. In the morning, he wakes up and blames them. His friends, he always has an excuse. When she gets pregnant, her boss says she can't come back part-time. After the baby is born, the lack of flexible job opportunities and childcare keeps her out of the workforce. She is socially isolated and financially dependent. He controls decision-making, and they are not equal. She is dependent on him, so she never tells anyone that he has started to hit her. She doesn't say anything to her family or friends. She grows more isolated. She has nothing else but him, so she lives with the violence until their story ends, one way or another. This story isn't a one-off. It's a story shared by 1 in 4 Australian women who experience physical or sexual violence from a current or former partner. And it's a story of 1 in 5 women since the age of 15 who experience sexual violence, including rape, 1 in 4 emotional violence, and 1 in 3 women physical violence. But it's also a story that affects children. More than half of the women who experienced violence had children in their care when the violence occurred. For victims and perpetrators, violence against women is the conclusion often reached after a life lived in a society where women and men are treated equally. But we, you and I, can change the narrative. Better education, policies, practices, support and funding can prevent this all too common story. When women and men have equal power, value, and opportunities in relationships and in society, violence against women is less likely. By nurturing caring, respectful, and equal relationships, and by creating equitable and inclusive communities in workplaces and institutions, we can create a society of equality, respect, where violence against women is unthinkable. Let's change the story, because ending violence against women starts with gender equality.
Okay. All right. Sorry, I'll just. Just get back to where we were. Here we go. So as I said, that's from the government perspective. So there's some things in there, obviously, we take a different view on in some of the details, but there's no question, while we have a different view about what gender equality is, there's no question in my mind, there is gender inequality within our community, right? So we're very clear about what gender equality is going to look like, and it's different to what the mainstream says, but that's not an excuse for us to not acknowledge that we have inequality within our communities, right? I'm open to have the argument with anybody who wants to do that, right? Perhaps it's a longer conversation, right? But the first question I always ask is, if somebody can honestly tell me that we treat our children, our boys and our girls the same way, sorry, not the same way, in terms of equality, in terms of our approach to them, I would challenge that, right? I have conversations all the time out of madrasas and a whole range of stuff around girls are allowed to do this, boys are allowed to do that. Girls aren't allowed to do this, boys aren't allowed to do that, right? And some of it is valid because Islam has certain positions around what we can and can't do, but some of it isn't valid. Some of it is either cultural, or we still have this issue of it's okay for boys to go out and do 1, 2, 3, but no, our girls have to stay in the house. And well, I ask, why do we allow boys to go out and do 1, 2, 3? Why don't we have the same level of control over our young men as we do over our young girls, right? So there's whole stuff like that. And we might have a conversation towards the end around some of those things in particular. So whatever it looks like for a community, there's no question that gender inequality is a big part of why violence occurs. So let's have, we ask some questions up here. What does your community organisation or workplace look like? So, for example, and I don't want you to ask the question, right? It's something for you to think about. But I've been involved in this community for a very long time, and for a long time, we struggle to get sisters involved at an organisational level in our community organisations, and yet on the ground, right? And I'm looking mostly at the brothers here. The ones who are doing most of the work on the ground are the sisters, right? So whenever we have community events, right, it's mostly the sisters who actually turn up and do the work. But if you have a look at the committees, rarely did we find sisters on the committees, right? And so when I ask the question, well, why is that? I would get answers, for example, like, well, it's not a good environment for them to be in. No one sister wants to be in a room full of men. I said, well, why does it have to be one sister, right? If we want to encourage women to be involved, the obligation is on us to create an environment that allows them to do that. Obviously not one sister alone isn't going to want to sit in a room with men for 3-4 hours in a community meeting. She's not going to be comfortable doing that. But isn't then the obligation on us to actually run our organisation in a way that doesn't cause that to happen in the first place? Modern day, one of the benefits of the pandemic was we all started doing things online. Who's to say we can't have sisters joining meetings through Zoom online? Why do they have to physically be there? There's always a way around some of these issues, right? You know, things of that sort. Who have the highest salaries, right? We still know in this country there is a huge gap between pay for the same work, right? And that's the important part. Same qualifications, same work. On average, men still get paid more than women do, right? And that's a big problem when it comes to how women, or why women don't escape or don't leave violent relationships. Their financial ability is a big part of why they can't do that. What's the breakup of household duties, right? And this is really, it's not important, but it's always a very animated conversation we have within Islam around the household duties, right? Because some brothers will say, yeah, but it's her obligation to do the household duties, right? So she should be doing all those duties, right? I question that, right? I don't know how much evidence there is from an Islamic perspective that it's actually her obligation to do the household duties, right? Culturally, that's certainly the case. But the Prophet ﷺ did his share of household duties. He mended his own clothes. He cleaned. He cooked. It's too good for us to do those things. During COVID, this is a really interesting statistic. I don't think I've got the slide up on this version. In COVID, when we were all locked down, and so we were all at home, you would expect that in that environment, the split of household duties might even up a little bit. It actually went the other way. So we men became more demanding in the household. So women end up doing more hours of household work during COVID than they were doing before COVID, right? Enough of the videos, let's just go on, just interest of time. Types of violence. Most people understand when I'm talking about violence around physical violence, right? And no one really in our community would condone physical violence in any way, right? But physical violence isn't the only way in which this plays out, right? We've got emotional violence, right? Where people are undermined, they're demeaned, they're insulted, they're put down, right? That's emotional violence. Physical violence, we all know. Cultural violence, so where people are forced to comply with a cultural way of doing things, which may not be something which they're comfortable with. So as an example, in some communities, there's an expectation that a woman, when she first gets married, will live with her in-laws, with her husband's family, right? That is not Islam. That's culture, right? Islamically, she has an absolute right to her own home. Even when a man takes multiple wives, every one of those wives has a right to her own home. That's what Islam says, right? This requirement that you live with your husband's family is a cultural thing. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying let's at least recognize what Islam says and what is cultural. Because what Islam says, halas, that's it. That's what Islam says. Cultural things, though, that's up to you. You can do them or you don't do them, right? Financial violence, right? Where men control the finances to such an extent that she is forced to do things just to be able to survive day to day, right? And so often this leads to the conversation, particularly with young people in our community around, well, what's my right, what's his right, and all these sort of things. And it goes from one extreme to the other. So I have lots of young sisters say yes, but his, what's mine is mine and what's his is mine, right? No, right? The man has an obligation to provide for his family, including his wife. So she has a right not to spend a single cent on herself in terms of her day-to-day provisions. That's what Islam says. That's your obligation as the man. So if you want to be the leader of the household, your obligation is to provide for your family. So that means feed, clothe, house, everything, right? She has an absolute right to her own wealth. You have no right to even ask her what wealth she has in Islam. Right? But at the same time, for the sisters, you have no right to access his wealth without his knowledge, right? So unless he's given you the right to spend of a certain money, so if there might be a joint account or something he gives you, and he says, yes, this is money you can spend or whatever, that's fine. But you can't, without him knowing, go into a bank account or go into his wallet. No, you can't do that. Right? So it works both ways, yeah? But there's no question that finances is used as, in this day and age, I would say is one of the main ways in which men exert control, right? Now it's changing because, particularly with our younger generation, because most of our children now are educated and they're working, right? So even the young sisters now are a little bit more financially independent, right? But that doesn't prevent them getting into situations where it still happens, where the man will forcibly take her earnings. It's haram. You can't do that, right? We need to educate our generations coming through on all these issues, right? I don't like talking around rights and obligations when it comes to marriage, right? If you are talking about rights and obligations, then the marriage is off to a rocky start to begin with, yeah? We should not be thinking about what is my right in marriage. We should be thinking about what is the best I can do in this situation, not what, rights are just the minimums, right? If all I want is my rights, that's all I'm going to get, right? That's not going to give me a happy life, just getting my right, yeah? I want to be giving somebody more than their due. And inshallah, I will get more than what I'm due. When we stop thinking about rights and we start thinking about equality in terms of our relationship, then rights don't become an issue anymore, right? As a couple, you will find the way in which it makes sense for you and your family to operate, right? Forget what the rest of your family, forget what your community says a woman should do or a man should do. Learn what Islam says, and then you find what works for you, right? We'll talk a little bit more about those as we go through. Psychological violence, right? Threatening, creating fear, tormenting. It happens a lot, right? Sexual violence. So it is a crime in Australia for what they call marital rape. So brothers, you cannot force yourself in this country onto your wife if she does not want to be intimate, right? It's a law in every state of this country, right? So that's the minimum, right? So I'm letting you all know it's a crime, right? And it's been a crime for a long time. It's not something new. But what I challenge our community to also think about is, well, Islamically, what is actually the position on intimacy? Yeah, because I hear a lot of, and for some reason it comes up mostly with the younger men. You know, but as a community, we really need to have a conversation around where our younger men are getting their information and their knowledge from, right? Around, well, it's my right. She has no right to deny me, right? You have no right to force her in Islam, right? Now, there is a hadith that says if a woman denies a husband, then the angels will curse her until Fajr and that sort of stuff. It's not your role to punish her if she denies you, because you don't know what's happening inside her. You don't know why there may be reasons why that she just doesn't want to share with you around why she can't be intimate, doesn't want to be intimate. That's between her and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? You can't force yourself Islamically on your wife, right? And there's a whole range of other issues in terms of not being violent, not hurting, all those sorts of things. As a community, we are terrible at having conversations around intimacy. And yet there's no haya in Islam. There's no modesty on these issues. When our young people are thinking about marriage, this is one of the most important things we should be teaching them, because it causes so much friction when couples first get married, right? Particularly with young men who've grown up in a non-Muslim society. They're exposed to so many things, particularly astaghfirullah, pornography and a whole range of things. It raises things in their head which are completely outside the norm. Like just from forget Islamically, just at a human level. That's not the way couples operate. It's not the way, it's not a healthy relationship what they are exposed to, right? But we're not very good at having these conversations and teaching our young men in particular around what a healthy, intimate relationship really is, yeah? There's spiritual abuse, right? Using the religion itself to abuse someone, right? Either forcing them to do something or saying, you know, if you don't do it, Allah's going to, you know, curse you, or whatever the case may be, right? Often in our context, it happens when a man takes a particular position within the din, which is valid, but his wife may have a different position, which is also valid, right? Well, you can't force her if she's holding a valid position, yeah? You know, in preparing these workshops, I did a focus group with some young men. I was at the southeast of Melbourne, and one of the issues that came up was one of the young men who was not born but raised in this country and went to university in this country, said, I have the absolute right to choose who my daughter gets married to. Doesn't matter what she thinks, right? And I said, okay, all right, let's leave that for the moment. There is a position in one of the madhahib that does say that, but it's not common across all four madhahib, yes? And I said, well, I'm not going to challenge you on that. Let's just go with that for the moment. I said, but what if your wife doesn't follow that madhab? She follows one of the others and says, no, you absolutely need the consent of your daughter to who she gets married. Doesn't mean you as the wali don't have a say, but you can't force her to marry someone she doesn't want to marry. I said, what would you do? He said, no, it's my right. I said, but your wife holds a different view, and it's Islamically an accepted view. And in fact, the alternative view, if you want to talk across the four madhahib, is the majority view, right? There's one position which is accepted. It's an accepted position within the religion, but it's certainly not the majority across the four madhahib, right? What would you do? No, I'm the man. I said, that's the problem. Right? That's spiritual abuse, both of the wife, of the mother and the daughter. But if the daughter says, no, I don't agree with that. In this madhab, which I follow, it says I have an absolute right to give my consent. If she's forced, right? So spiritual abuse. And then we have social abuse, so isolating people. And this is also a problem within our community around men forcing women into situations around not being out of the house, not being able to socialize, not being able to contact with their family, right? And this is a complex one for us because there are rules within the din that say, you know, a man has certain rights around who can enter his home, who his wife can associate with, right? There's no question about that. But there's also a line that you've got to be careful where you cross over. And it goes from you playing the role of the caretaker of the family to one being, really, you're just being arbitrary now. It's zulm. You're just oppressing people for no reason. Right? Why do you really want to stop her, you know, seeing her family? Really challenge yourself about why. Yeah. So we've got to think about things beyond just physical violence, right? Violence in this day and age is all of these things, and often it covers parts of a lot of these different things. And it escalates to violence usually when the woman starts to then push back on some of this stuff. But ultimately, it's about this issue of fear, power, and control, right? Men are struggling in this day and age to understand what it is to be a man and what that means in terms of your role as being the person in charge, right? that if I don't assert myself, then I'm not being the man. No, you don't. You don't need to assert yourself to be the man, right? So when I do a lot of training around leadership, right, and one of the things I teach people from a leadership perspective, if people follow you because they're scared of you, the moment you go, they will know they won't do what you want. They won't follow you. If people follow you because they believe in the things that you stand for, it doesn't matter if you're there or not, they will do the things that you want them to do. Right? So if you think about Islam, if the Prophet ﷺ and Islam was all built around fear, when the Prophet passed away, we would have always gone back to being the jahl of the pre-Islamic era. But it wasn't about fear. It was about the message. It was about understanding what the vision is. And in our own households, we have to be the same. Right? I'm a father of 4 daughters. I don't know where they are every minute of the day. If I'm not comfortable that I have a relationship of respect and trust with my children, that when they are somewhere where I have no visibility of them, that they will still do the things that I would want them to do, then really I failed as a father. If they're doing this because they're scared of me, then the moment they think I can't see what they're doing, I'll ask them what they're going to do. Yeah. Leadership isn't about instilling fear and forcing people to do what you want them to do. That's not leadership. Right? We'll talk about leadership a bit more. Does anyone have any questions on any of those? I can't see the chat. Is there? Can somebody just have a look for me in the Zoom chat, just in case there's any questions or comments on any of that? No? Anybody in the room have a question or comment they want to do before I move on to this one? Yeah. Yes. That's the joke. That's the joke. Yeah. The sisters now, because they've learned to live more, say, my money's my money, his money is our money. Yeah. It is a joke. It's a joke. It's a good 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 joke. All right. So they're the different types of violence. So now we're going to have a conversation around what we call the drivers of violence. So these are the causes. So what leads to violence? It really comes down to 4 things. The first one is the issue of control, right? So when men control decisions and resources in the home, workplace, or community, they have an opportunity to abuse power with violence, while women have less power to stop it. So again, this is all coming from mainstream position, yeah? So the language, all those sorts of things. But the point here is actually a valid one, right? It's about control, right? The next one is this issue of gender, right? So their idea is where there are strict ideas about women's and men's roles, identities in relationships, this can contribute to violence, right? Because historically in Western cultures, the role of the man has been the one which has been valued more than the role of the women. And so that gives the man a sense of power and control over the woman. As I said, we have a very different view around roles, right? But the issue for us is a lot of our practices have come through cultural things rather than the din, rather than the faith. And when I talk about this publicly with non-Muslims, I actually say the problem in our community, we've inherited from you. Because when you invaded our countries, right? So you think about this. Islam changed the status of women completely, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a bit further. For hundreds of years, the role of and the status of women, from Islam perspective, was very different to what it was before Islam came. And then Europe, the European superpowers invaded all the Muslim countries, and they brought their practices into those countries, right? Now, women were treated still at that time like property in Western countries, whereas in Islam it was very different in Islamic countries. Islam doesn't give you a list of things to do and not do, other than a very small number of things around how we pray and how we worship, right? Islam says, this is the good things, these are the bad things at a principle level. because that's how Islam is able to cover so many different situations, so many different cultures. As a man, if I really want to find something that would justify me being the person in control, I can, right? And we'll talk about one of the areas later, right? So it wasn't hard for Muslim men to come on board with the Western ideas that you're the man, you're in charge, you should be in charge, and find things within either the Hadith or the Quran that they would use to justify that, right? And so they accepted all of those things that the West brought in around men being in control of everything. And they ran with that for hundreds of years. The West then moved on. They, in inverted commas, they evolved their thinking and they left us with these notions which were actually not part of Islam. And so we've taken on board a lot of this stuff, right? So what I encourage people to do is let's go back and just go back to what Islam says. At least let's be clear. Islam says this, our cultural practices are that. And we choose which part of our cultural practices we want to do. And particularly for parents, I remind parents that whether we like it or not, our children and our grandchildren are going to form their own cultural identities in this country. And those cultural identities are not going to be the same as ours, right? They are going to push back on some things. And unless we are prepared to accept that Islam says this, culture is this, we're going to have intergenerational issues, right? Our children are going to say, well, why? Islam doesn't say that. Okay, we need to understand those things, yeah? Because otherwise what will happen is they will go and do it without you. They will continue to form their own identity and they'll do it without you being involved in that process. And that's where we have a serious risk of them accepting ideas and concepts that are more Western-based than Islamically based, right? Because we're not open to having the conversation, okay, yep, this is a cultural issue. I might not like it because culturally this is what I do, but I accept it's not religious. And so that's your choice as a young person whether to do that or not. We want to stop all of that, and so they then reject anything else that we want to say as well, right? We've got to really be careful around how we manage that scenario between the generations. We're going to have more conversation about gender in a bit. This issue of disrespect, right? And it plays out in a whole range of ways. The joking, those sorts of things, with putting people down, things of that sort, yeah? And when disrespect to women and girls becomes norm, that's how you start to build a culture where it's not a huge step from being disrespectful to then for that to then go over into trying to control and then becoming physically violent. And the last one is around condoning. So by condone means we accept certain behavior, right? We see things, we hear things, and we don't speak up. And when we don't speak up, people take that to mean that we're accepting what's going on. And it's a challenge for us because, culturally, we don't like to interfere in what we see around us. It's not my role to tell someone, "Oh, should you really have said that?" So we don't want to be, we don't want to put ourselves in a situation where, our social groups think, "Well, hang on, this person's now a Western sellout," and a whole range of stuff, right? But what does the Hadith say about oppression and when you see an injustice? The Hadith says, if you see something which is wrong, you stop it with your hand. And if you can't, you stop it with your tongue. And if you can't do that, at least your heart. It's an obligation on us Muslims. If you see something wrong, you are obligated to do something. At the lowest level of iman is to hold it against you, hold it in your heart that you're against it. But if we don't speak up, and you have to do it in the right way, yeah? I'm not saying you just come straight up, right? There's a hikmah in how you approach the situations. But until we start having conversations within our communities, within our own social circles, around, really, you shouldn't have said that, or you shouldn't have done that. You do it privately, right? Until we start doing those things, people assume that everybody around them is on board with what they're doing and saying, right? So that's what condoning is about. That's what they call, you'll hear the expression bystander, interventions. That's what bystander syndrome is all about, where something happens and we don't interfere. we as a community suffer from this a lot when it comes to racism and Islamophobia, right? We say, why not? You saw and you heard, why didn't you intervene? It's the same thing. It's the same thing, yeah? So all of the things that lead to violence generally sit under one of these four categories, all right? We did a survey of the Muslim community nationally, beginning of 2020, on these issues of domestic violence and attitudes and understanding. Because we want to see, one, was there any difference between what we thought on these issues and what the wider community thought? But we also wanted to see, really, what are the main issues that we have that we could, tailor some of our workshops around. So I just want to go through some of them, right? And just get your reaction to whether you agree, disagree, how you feel about some of those things. So we asked the question, women and girls are likely to seek help when they have experienced sexual violence and rape, right? So people, do you think women are likely to do that? Half of men, more than half of men said yes, they thought women and girls would seek help. About a third of women said that. The reality is most women and girls, right, do not seek help, right? For a whole range of reasons why, right? And it's a greater issue in minority communities, which have a bit of more of a communal approach to them, right? So Western society is very individualistic, right? When you're part of a community, particularly communities that don't talk about these issues, the victim themselves feel embarrassed, feel like there's a stigma about raising these issues, right? So we shouldn't think, oh, if something was wrong, she would speak up. No, the statistics actually tell us no. Most of them won't speak up until it gets to such a point that something bad's going to happen, yeah? I hear this all the time. Many women exaggerate how unequal women are treated in Australia, right? So women make it up. It's not really as bad as they make it out to. Again, 43% of men agree or strongly agree with that statement. Interestingly, only 18% of women agree with that statement, right? Men, women do not exaggerate this issue, right? There is no evidence whatsoever to substantiate that women make this up. You think about it. It is such a traumatic experience for a woman to go through publicly an allegation of rape or sexual assault, right? No woman wants to do that, right? Does it happen? Of course it happens, right? But statistically, on average, no, women do not exaggerate this stuff, right? We need to put this issue behind us. If you hear a story, there's a chance that there's something to that story, right? Women going through custody battles, again, another one we hear a lot, often make up or exaggerate claims of domestic violence in order to improve their case, right? 45% of men agree with that statement. Only 16% of women agree with that statement, right? Again, no. Does it happen? Yes, it does. Does it happen to a extent where it's an issue? No, right? Majority of women do not make things up for court cases. The majority of women finally speak out during a court case of things that they've kept silent about, not that they're making it up, right? Even if you don't agree with what I've just said, the fact that 3 times as many men have a different view to the women as this is something you need to be aware of, right? It is common for sexual assault accusations to be used as a way of getting back at men, right? 39% of men agree or strongly disagree, 15% of women. No. No. Again, no, it doesn't happen. Or it doesn't happen so much that it's something which is worth clouding all the other issues about, all right? It is a woman's duty to stay in a violent relationship to keep the family together, right? It's pleasing to see only 14% of men agree with that statement, only 6% of women, right? This used to be a very common view. It's not anymore, right? No one should stay in a relationship if it's violent, right? Islamically, you should not stay in a relationship that's violent, right? When our imams tell a woman, you have sabr, sister, you have sabr about certain things. You don't have sabr when you are being abused and you're potentially going to suffer, potentially being killed or something of that nature. Yeah, divorce is not haram in our deen, right? Our deen is very clear about family relationships, and it clearly says it's not something which we promote. We go through lots of things around reconciliation and keeping family together, but of course, there comes a point where the best thing for everybody is just divorce and go your separate ways, treat each other with justice and move on, right? When jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. This is an interesting one, right? Only 29% of men, so roughly 30% of men agree with that. 15% of women. It makes a bit more sense in our community, this question, than it does in the mainstream, because yes, it is the man's obligation to provide for the family. So if jobs are scarce, Islamically, it's the man who has the responsibility of going out there to find the job and provide for the family. So I can understand this one, right? And this is an area where we would differ from Western societies on, right? The woman has no obligation to provide for the family at all, right? But it's actually not that dissimilar to what mainstream thinks on this issue. A university education is more important for a boy than a girl, right? 20% of men answered yes to that question. So 1/5 of men in our community still think that a university education is more important for a boy than a girl. Fathers, 5%, only 5% of women answered yes to that question, right? If you still think in this day and age that boys have more priority to be educated than girls, I really encourage you to have a good hard look in the mirror for a whole range of reasons, right? Where in our deen does it say that a girl has no right to be educated? I'm actually going to give you the opposite, right? Who has the obligation of educating your children? The father or the mother? Islamically, where does that obligation lie? It actually lies on the mother, not the father. What was the first revelation in Islam? Iqra, read. Right? This idea that our boys have more right to an education than girls, we have to get rid of this. That is a worry that we still have 20% of men. Now, I'm sure it doesn't apply in this room, but statistically, think about it. We have more than 20 people in this room, right? Which means 3 or 4 people in this room share that view statistically. Now, most of the people who come to these workshops are already on board with these principles, yeah? But that's a huge number, 20%. And it causes a problem for young girls in particular, right? It is acceptable for a man to keep track of his wife's location, calls, or activities through her mobile phone or other electronic device without her consent, right? Nearly 1/4 of men agreed with that statement. So 1/4 of men in our community think it's okay to spy on their wives. That is what that question is. Because it says without her consent, right? Now, on my phone, like others, I've got the Find My phone thing. I've got an iPhone, and our whole family does it. So we all know that we can see wherever any of us are at any point in time, right? That's not what this is, right? We've all consented to that. We all do that, right? This is without consent. When you come to your own home, so not to a visitor's house, so you come home, you've been out, you come home from work, whatever it is, what does Islam say you're meant to do before you enter the house? Give salams. Why? So the person who's inside knows somebody else is coming. So if your own wife has a right for you not to enter your own home without giving her notice that you're coming, do you really think Islam gives you the right to spy on where she is? Really? If you have that level of distrust in your wife, divorce her. I'm telling you, divorce her. That is not a healthy relationship. If you can't trust your wife to do and be where she says she's going to be, you have bigger problems than worrying about whether you can track where she is. But a quarter of our men. None of this is significantly different to the mainstream. It's just a problem of men, not Muslim men in particular, right? There are some things about leadership. To what extent do you agree with the following statement? Men make better leaders than women, right? 41% of men agreed with that statement. 6% of Australian-born women agreed with that statement. It's interesting enough that, you know, Australian-born men and overseas-born men, not too dissimilar. Again, whether you agree or disagree, the important thing here is look at the difference in what women view about this and what men view about it. Right? So nearly half of men agree with that statement. You know, about 10% of women agree with that statement, right? Men make better religious leaders than women. Interestingly enough, that comes down a little bit, right? But it's consistent for overseas-born men, right? So our migrant men actually have about the same view around leadership. Our younger men have a different view around religious leadership and general leadership. More women should be in leadership positions. So even though we have different views about who are better leaders, men still think there should be more women in leadership positions, which is a really good thing, right? Not quite as high as the women, but it's a positive step forward, right? Again, there's actually not a lot that's surprising in that one. Men should take control in a relationship, right? 37% of men agreed, 9% of females agreed, right? Men should be the head of the household, about 60% to 34%. Women prefer a man to be in charge of the relationship, 42 to 23. So again, men should take control in a relationship. Huge difference between how our women see this and how our men see it. Put aside whether you think as though you should be in control or not, right? There's a huge disparity between what we collectively as men think and what our women think. And if we're not aware of that, we're going to run into problems because expectations are going to be very different, all right? Don't worry about this one. Just on that survey, just so that you know, so when they do the election surveys, they poll about 1,500, between 1,500 and 2,000 respondents to do the polls for elections, yeah? So there's about 11 million eligible voters in Australia, and so they do a survey of about 1,500 to 2,000 people out of 11 million to predict those results. We've got about 850,000 Muslims in the country, and we had about 600 responses. So the survey is actually statistically a very valid survey. And it was a national survey, and the demographics, so the age and the geographic location is pretty consistent with what the census says we as a community look like. So it's actually very reliable data on that. Yep. About 850,000. Yeah. And that was about 600 responses to that survey. So it's actually a higher percentage than they use for election surveys. All right. What's the time now? What we might do, let's just take a 5-minute break. Let people stretch their legs, right? I don't want you falling asleep on me. So people on Zoom, we'll just take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back and we'll continue, inshallah. Yeah, of course. Yes. No, we didn't ask the other way around. We didn't ask. Look, I don't know what the answer would be, but I don't know what the statistics would be, but the answer would be exactly the same. We shouldn't be spying, right? But no, we didn't ask the question. That's the key thing. Yes. Yeah. The survey was about 80 questions, so it was actually quite a long survey. And the reason why we did is because there's the government does a survey on these same issues. And so about 70 of the questions matched what the government does in their survey, and then the others were the specific for our community. That way we could compare what the Muslim community thinks compared to the Australian. And that's where we say there's actually very little difference, because we know, because our survey has the same questions. So there's actually very little difference. So even though some of these things make you scratch your head a little bit, it's actually the same issue across the whole community. Yeah. It'll be the opposite, inshallah. Yes, that's right. Just check what's the chat. Yeah, I'm having my tea, alhamdulillah. Yeah. We didn't ask a question in the survey of specific ethnic background, so we can't do a cut because some of the numbers are just too small. So outside of the main communities, so we're slightly off topic, just so that people get an idea of just how diverse our community is. In the 2016 census, so this is not the last day was 21, but in 2016 census, so there are currently 195 nation states across the world, including Palestine and the Vatican, because they're recognised by the UN. In the 2016 census, the Australian Muslim community had people from 183 of those countries. Right? So we are hugely diverse, and part of our message to government is they put everything under this category of culturally and linguistically diverse, right? And so yeah, we're just treating it. We're looking after people through cold, and we're saying to them, you know what? We have 183 different cultures within our community, but the one thing which unites all of them is their faith, right? You've got to start dealing with this community from a faith perspective, not a culture, because then you've got to deal with 183 different cultures. Whereas if we can help people understand what their faith says, because that's what binds them, that's the main thing that in terms of their identity. You might be an Australian Muslim, you might be Indonesian Muslim, might be Malay, you're a Muslim, right? That 183 nationalities all unite on Islam. And so we're trying to get the government to get their head around. They've got to, particularly, and it's hard in this environment where society generally is so anti-religion, right? It is becoming harder and harder to publicly say your values are based on faith and religion. Yeah, absolutely. Which means we've got to go out there and have the courage to be able to, and say that even more. And this issue, this area, and we'll get into this issue around gender a little bit, is a huge problem because publicly you speak up against any issue of gender and you get attacked. And particularly if you're coming from a position of religion and faith, you get discounted straight away. You know, you can't say, well, I don't agree with this because my faith says otherwise, right? A whole range of stuff. And one of the big challenges for our younger community is they're now being exposed to all of those concepts which are being driven everywhere, media, TV, it doesn't matter, government. And government is taking out of the public space the alternative view, right? So even, you know, I'm slightly off topic, but obviously even here now in Victoria, they introduced the laws last year around what they call gay conversion suppression laws, right? So if your own child in Victoria comes to you and says, I'm struggling with this issue of my sexual identity, right? I think I'm attracted to someone of the opposite sex, right? You could be breaking the law if you say to your own child, you need to stop its head on, right? And the New South Wales government is looking to introduce that same law, and we're working against that up there, right? So it's becoming so much harder for anybody who's based their values on religion and faith to publicly take a stand on this issue. So really part of what we're trying to do here is give people the language and the concepts to feel a little bit more confident that they can say, well, you know, Islam says 1, 2, 3, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit later around the verse from Surah Nisa, which the non-Muslims quote all the time around striking as being, you know, your religion promotes violence, right? And I'll talk about that a little later. You know, we've got to be confident enough to say, you know, I don't care. I don't care what you think, right? This is Islam. This is what I believe. Well, you think whatever you want to think. I don't have to justify myself. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and part of our issue is as a community, it's, you know, the brother's talking about, I've done workshops with you before. So before it actually became a really hot topic, I actually did a talk here in this very masjid on this issue of LGBT, right? This was going back now, I reckon it's probably 6 years ago, right? Yeah, it was a very long time ago, right? Because we as a community don't know how to have that conversation internally, right? And so we open ourselves up to all these claims of being homophobic and a whole range of stuff because we don't know how to have a conversation internally because we don't understand the nuances. Like it's a very complex area, even Islamically, it's a very complex area. Because we don't understand it, we're worried if we have the conversation that we might say something or encourage someone to do something which is haram, right? But in us not having that conversation, the conversation happens without us. It's happening outside without us. Our young people having the conversations without us. We've got to equip ourselves as a community much better to have those conversations. Because otherwise, you know, we're going to have more and more of our young people who, while they themselves may not follow that path, won't see it as something which is objectionable or wrong. Right? All right. If everyone on Zoom, we'll start again, inshallah. I think we've had our 5 minutes. We want to try and get through as much as we can, inshallah. All right. Before we carry on, anybody have any comments, questions? Brother? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
The question is when the kids were explaining from Islamic point of view or our practical point of view, they always question.
Yes.
Why.
Yeah.
And then sometimes it's not met with their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think that community must be? Because it's happening in Canada as well.
It does.
It's not connected with
yeah.
the way you think this thinking.
Yeah. Because most of our teaching and education of young people from a din perspective is done purely on the basis of halal and haram. These are the things which are halal, these are the haram, right? We want to make sure they understand they can do this, they can't do this. We want to make sure they know how to pray. What we don't do very well, though, is actually talk about the bigger picture, the principles of Islam, right? And my view is we should talk about those before we talk about the specifics, right? So in this area, right, if we teach our young people the essence of marriage is actually rahmah and muhabba and love, because that's what it is, then we teach them about the rights and obligations of being a husband and wife. They will view those rights and obligations in the context of the fundamental relationship is what? Is one of mercy and rahmah. But we don't. We go the other way. We teach them what the rights and obligations are, what the halal and haram is, and then afterwards we try and go back and say, oh, but by the way, mercy and rahmah is the main part. No, if it was, then why did you teach me that first? Right? But it applies in everything, right? Yes, and I'm not talking about the fadawi. We're not going to teach people how to pray and do those sorts of things. But before we do that, let's teach them about what are the sacred things in Islam? Ancestry, lineage, my life, you know, those sorts of things, right? We don't have enough people within our community who can talk about those things from an Islamic perspective, but then be able to have the same conversation and link it to what they're being taught in schools and universities, right? So the one thing the West has done so well is to convince people that their education systems and the way they teach is the only way it can happen. So our young people go to university and they think if it's something isn't taught at university, it can't be good. So if we can't at least talk the language, right? So around the dinner table, if I can't have a conversation with my children around what the Western concept is of gender and sexuality, how am I going to convince them that Islamic position is correct, right? So just take some words, for example, right? Gender in a Western context is not the same as sex, right? So what your gender is and what your sexuality is are very different, right? So gender is biological, it's what you're born with. Sexuality is whatever you want it to be, right? So they've convinced the world that sexuality is a social construct. It's just something that society makes up, which means it can be whatever you want it to be. Stuck for a lot. Islam has never divided gender from sexuality. Has no need to, right? Islam doesn't place value on what your sexuality is. There's no such thing in Islam about a sexual identity. Why do I need to attach my identity to my sexuality? It's a foreign concept Islamically. But we don't have those conversations with our young people. So before we worry about them accepting that idea, let's at least be able to show them the fallacy in the argument to start with, right? The West has convinced people that sexuality is so important that it's central to your identity of who you are. No. The important things about who you are X, Y, Z. So when people say to me, well, most of the people, you know, Islam has no problem with sexuality. And so I said, well, Islam has never placed value on sexuality. You can think whatever you want to think about your sexuality. I don't care. Islam doesn't care about what you think about your sexuality. It has zero worth. Doesn't make you better or worse. What you do is a different issue. And what you do is a different issue. What your gender is, right? Islamically, no. So when people say to me, well, don't you care about, you know, all these people who are transgender, whatever? I said, no. My main concern isn't the fact that they're transgender. My main concern is the fact that they disbelieve. So what do you mean? So, well, the first thing I was going to ask isn't what your sexuality is. Going to say, do you believe? If you don't believe, who cares what your sexuality is? You're going to hell. End of story. I'm very upfront with it. If you don't believe, you're going to hell forever. If you believe, but you are struggling with sexuality, also I might punish you, but at some point, you'll make it back to Jannah. That's Islamically. We believe that. If you have an atom's weight of belief in your heart, you'll make it to Jannah eventually. I don't know how long you're going to be punished for. But if you disbelieve, those doors are closed. You're in hell forever. So my main concern is your belief. But for another reason, if I can't convince you that Allah exists and of his nature, there's nothing I can possibly say that will convince you of my position around sexuality. Because my whole position around sexuality is based on what Oswald says. And if you don't believe that there's a divine creator, and you don't believe that divine creator is infallible, then what can I say? I can't say anything that's going to convince you otherwise, because you've got in your head that you know more than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the whole issue around transgender is Allah got it wrong, astaghfirullah. Allah doesn't get it wrong. Whatever gender you were born with, that's what you're intended to be born with. What you think and feel is something very different. Islamically is very different. But you can't say, I should have been this. No. You're putting, you're saying Allah's made a mistake, astaghfirullah. Allah doesn't make mistakes. If you think a particular way and you feel certain things, but you were born male or female, Allah intended that. So the struggle for you is, how do you reconcile your individual thoughts and concerns with the gender that Allah gave you? That's not his problem. That's the test he gave you. Now, if I can't convince you of the creator, though, but it doesn't matter. There's nothing I'm going to say. So before we have any conversation about sexuality, let's have a conversation about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the existence of the divine and the nature of the divine. I'll have that conversation before I care about this issue of sexuality. In the meantime, you do what you do and I'll do what I do. But don't force me to publicly have to say what you're doing is right. In a Western environment, you have the absolute right to do what you do as long as it doesn't impinge on me. But inclusion doesn't mean I have to publicly support what you're doing. I can work with you as an individual. I have no issues. I'm not your judge. I don't know what's in your heart. But at a principle level, no, I'm not going to support what you stand for. That's not, I can't do that. That's the whole problem that the sports people have with the jumpers and all those sorts of things, right? I will play in the sporting team, but the moment you say to me, I have to wear a jumper that says not just it's okay to be inclusive, but this particular lifestyle choice, and we say it's a lifestyle choice because Allah doesn't make mistakes, right? Well, I can't do that. If you put a logo on the sports jumper that is around inclusion generally, no issues. I will wear it because everybody has a right to live their life in peace and harmony and do what they want to do. But the moment you put something specific, that means a specific thing. If that doesn't according to my values, then I can't. Now, publicly, that is not a safe position to take publicly, right? Somebody will see what I've just said online and I'll get abused and a whole range of stuff. But as Muslims, we have to stop. You know what? We have to be able to now say, you know what? I don't care anymore. Islam says this. I have to say what Islam says. I'm not attacking you. I'm not judging you. It's not for me to judge. I've got enough things to worry about myself, let alone worry about anybody else. But I can't say what you're doing is correct. Did I answer the question, brothers? I hope so, inshallah. All right, let's carry on. I want to talk about leadership because so much of what we're talking about really hinges on this issue of what does it mean to lead, right? So there's no question Islamically, the man is the, use a phrase, leader, caretaker, whatever of the household, right? That's not a position which the Western society likes, right? Their view is, no, everybody, it's a partnership and there's a partnership, even in partnerships. You have so if you come out of a professional services environment, lawyers or accountants, they have partnerships. Even in partnership, there's something called a managing partner. Somebody at the end of the day has to be in charge, right? You can't run everything by committee. It just doesn't work, right? At the end of the day, somebody has to make decisions. And in the family, Allah says that's the man, right? Whether the West agree or it doesn't matter whether they agree or disagree. That's what it is. The problem we've got is most stuff. I shouldn't say that. There are men within our community who don't understand what that means, and this is where culture really has come into play with what it means to lead. So I want to have a conversation about leadership, right? Sorry, let's go back this way. So there are 5 things that make good leaders. So I'm just talking generally now, not about the family, right? The first one is technical skill, right? So to be a leader in the workplace or whatever, you've got to be good at something. You don't have to be good at everything, but you have to be good at something, because that's what your credit hinges on. So if you think about a workplace, if your boss is good at nothing that anybody in his team is good at, they're not going to last long as a leader. They've got to be seen as being credible and have some expertise in some area. You've got to be a good communicator. You can't lead if you can't communicate, right? Leadership is about getting others to do things. You need to be able to communicate those things. You have to be good at what we call change management, right? So basically leadership is, how do you help people get from position A to position B? How do you move them from today to tomorrow? How do you improve them from here to here, whatever it might be? That's change. There's a process. There's skills around change. And then you have to get results. Leaders are judged by results. So in the family context, if your family is worse off today than it was yesterday, you've failed as a leader. At the very least, they should be as good today as they were yesterday, right? You should be striving to get your family in a better position today than they were yesterday as a leader. Right? They're the four main things that from a skills perspective, you want in leaders. But there's something that sits on top of all of that, that without it, you will never be a good leader. Can anybody think of what that might be? So we've got technical skills, you've got communication, you've got change, you've got results. What's the one thing do you think might sit on top of all of that makes a good leader? Nobody wants to have a go? Oh, all right. I'll give it to you. It's character. So in Western management theory, this model isn't Islam. This model is Western management theory. It took them 1400 years to come to the realization that the most important thing about leadership is character. What did the Prophet ﷺ tell us? Akhlaq, character. When Sayyidina Aisha was asked to describe the Prophet, how did she describe him? He was the walking Quran. What does that mean? It means he lived the Quran. That was his character. Before revelation, what was he known as? The trustworthy. So before he was a prophet, his society still named him the trustworthy, right? Western management took them 1400 years, all research, and this came out of a research which went over 10 years of 500 global companies for them to realize that character is the most important thing, right? So that's Western concept of leadership. From an Islamic perspective, right? So a lot of this slide comes from work that was done by Dr. Jamal Badawi, who's a Canadian scholar. I don't know if anybody's heard of Dr. Jamal Badawi, and Dr. Rafiq Begum, who looked at management theory and then extracted things out of the seerah around prophetic leadership. And these are the characteristics. First one is around a man of trust, right? If people can't trust you, they're not going to let you lead them, right? You have to be trustworthy. You have to hold yourself to account. This process of muhasabah, right? When you put your head down on the pillow at night, do you go through a process to say, is what I've done today good or bad? Could I have done something better? Should I have acted something different? Before you hold others to account, you have to hold yourself to account. You have to hold the mirror up to yourself first. Yeah. There has to be a sense of justice, of adl in what you do. Right? As leaders, you will often have situations where you could do one of a number of choices which are all valid. The process in how you decide which way to go, if there isn't justice in that, then you're just becoming arbitrary. Right? And this is the road to oppression zone, right? So if you're leading your household, and you can do one of three things, and one of those things, is going to hurt your family, but it imposes sets your authority, well, is that really the right decision to make, right? There's got to be rahmah, right? The Quran tells us the Prophet ﷺ was sent what? As a mercy to mankind. He was sent as a mercy to mankind. Of all of the divine attributes, of all of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what are the two names that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forced us, in effect, to call on him more than any others. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Why do we think that it's those names that we call on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more than any others? He's the most just, he's the most powerful, he's the most, all of those things. And yet it's Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Because the essence of our relationship with the ultimate leader, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is one of mercy. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what we do, how good we are. If we lose his mercy, then we're done for. Right? We know the hadith that says, somebody will given the choice. Do you want to go in the Jannah based on your actions? Do you want to be judged on your actions? Or do you want to go on my mercy? Going on the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Doesn't matter how good you are. Right? If the essence of our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one of mercy, how can the essence of our relationship with each other be anything other than rahmah and mercy? So as fathers, as husbands, as brothers, the heart of that whole relationship is one of rahmah, one of mercy. Yeah. Knowledge. Right? Two parts. One, our approach to ilm in Islam is you learn the things you need to learn at the time you need to know them. So if you're never ever going to go into your own business, you don't need to learn the fiqh of business, of trade. You don't need to know that. Until you're thinking about marriage, you don't need to learn the fiqh of marriage. But once you start thinking about marriage, it becomes obligatory on you to learn the fiqh of marriage, right? So there are things we need to learn. So we collectively need to learn things about families and how to raise children, right? There's lots of stuff out of the seerah around how you parent, right? But there's also recognition within Islam that you can't know everything. The Prophet ﷺ didn't know everything outside of matters of revelation. Right? The Sahaba always gave him advice. Some of it he asked, some of it was unsolicited. Right? They might say to him, Ya Rasul, is this a matter of revelation? If he says no, then no, so then I think you should do whatever. Right? We have to accept it. We don't know everything. So it's okay to ask. It's okay to ask your wife, what do you think about this? It's okay to ask your children, what do you think about this? Right? Don't think, Carlos, I'm the leader. I have to make every decision on my own and I have to know everything about everything, right? It's actually counter to what Islam is. This issue of shura, right? So shura is often translated as consulting, right? You'll see there I've got collaborating. Right? Remember, when we translate from Arabic to English, right? There's lots of things where there's just no direct translation. Right? And translation is often based on our knowledge over time and language, right? In this day and age, I think collaboration is a much better translation of shura than consultation, right? And the fundamental difference between the two is this. Consultation is, I'm coming to ask you your opinion about the solution I'm thinking, essentially, right? I'm coming to you and I say, I'm thinking of doing 1, 2, 3. Can I have your view? It's good. It's a commendable thing, right? Collaboration is, though, I come to you and say, the situation is X, Y, Z. What do you think? Not about the solution. What do you think about the situation? Because I may not be able to think up of all the options. If I've already come to you with what my preferred idea is, your focus is just on that. Whereas if I come to you with, can we have a conversation about what's happening? And let's explore what's happening. You might help me come up with possible situations, solutions, which I would never even think of. And you, as a person I'm engaging with, will feel much more empowered if you're part of the conversation around understanding the problem than if all I'm doing is getting your input into what I'm proposing to do. Right? There's a difference between consultation and collaboration. So I think that the better thing that aligns with the way the seerah and the Prophet ﷺ operated was around collaboration. Taqwa, right? As a leader, you have to be mindful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching you every minute of the day. Doesn't matter who else is watching, doesn't matter if no one's watching. If you forget that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching you, then you open the door to doing things which are going to be displeasing to him. But if you're always reminding yourself, others watching me, right? And as leaders, we always want to be pursuing excellence. We want to be doing things in the best possible way we can, right? As Muslims in everything, that's what we want to be doing. And the last one is around wisdom, around hikmah, right? So with all of that, there are still ways and means of doing things. You have to apply some wisdom. You know, when your children don't do what you want, you have to apply wisdom in how you discipline them and how you respond to that, how you deal with those situations. If you've got a dispute, between your partner, you can say, you know what, I'll say you listen what I want, and it's this. But do you really think that's going to get the best outcome, right? There's a wisdom there. And then we're back to this issue of amanah. And I want to finish with this issue of amanah. Your family is not yours. They do not belong to you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us our family as an amanah. They belong to Him. It's a trust. Allah entrusts us with our family. And as people who have a trust, our obligation is to return that trust to its rightful owner in a better situation than when we were given it. So on the day of Qiyamah, on the day of judgment, Allah is going to ask each and every one of us, what did you do with the amanah I gave you? How did you fulfill the trust I gave you? And our wives and our children are going to be witnesses either for or against us. And they're going to say either my father, my husband did everything possible for me to fulfill and reach my potential, or they're going to say something else. Right? Keep this in the back of your mind. They're not things that belong to us. Islam came with a very specific purpose on this issue. That's how women were. Women were treated as property. Western society treated women as property until the 1800s. Islam changed all of that. So no, they're human beings like everybody else. They're individuals. We all belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're not us to do with as we please. Yeah, so just keep that in mind. If we as men lead in this way, how could we possibly find ourselves in a situation where we would commit violence? Any act of violence is not going to be consistent with this model of leadership. And this is the prophetic model of leadership. Right? Is there any reported instance at all where the Prophet ﷺ used violence against his family? Not a single one. Not one. So let's leadership. I'll go through those. I think I've spoken enough about this one, so I'm going to skip this. All right, I want to now talk about specific principles from Islam on this issue of families and relationships, which we would say, if we as Muslims live by, right, clearly say that violence is not permissible in Islam in the context we're talking about. All right. I just want to show this short video. Can you hear that?
Is the home but also for what happens inside our soul. The most fragile of homes, home to the most ferocious of families.
Let me just see if I can do this a different way. If we can put this on mute, yeah, put that on mute, and then I'll All right, Jazakallah khairan. It's a good little summary, that one. Mashallah, he's a Sydney brother, does some very good, what they call spoken or word poetry. All right, so how does Islam respond, or how do we respond to this? There's really 4 key relationships that we talk about here. So everything we're speaking about today really fits under one of these. And we've got to remind ourselves that these are the essence of what we need to do to build a harmonious home and a community. The first of them is understanding and perfecting our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Everything. We've always got to come back to, how am I perfecting my relationship with my creator? Because if that's my focus, then really the rest of it will take care of itself. Right? And this is with the whole issue around taqwa and being conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? The next one is perfecting our own character before we hold others to account. How do we ourselves, how do we improve our own character? What are we doing every single day that emulates what the Prophet ﷺ did, how he lived his life, right? The third one is around service, khidmah. The heart of the role of a leader in Islam is service. The Prophet ﷺ said, I am nothing but a servant. I sit as a servant. I eat as a servant. The greatest of creation says he was a servant. He's, the title of Abdullah, the son of Allah, right? So as men, service is the heart of that role as the leader, not to be served. If your expectation is, because I'm the head of the household is here to serve me, you have got it the wrong way around. It is the role of the leader of the household is not a bonus. It's a responsibility. It's an obligation. It's about you fulfilling your role to others, not about how others are going to serve you. And then what we do in the home and what we do outside have to be the same. How we behave inside and outside have to be the same. Often we behave better outside the home than we do in the home on these issues. We're more respectful. We're more lenient. We say kinder words to people out. We're more forgiving to people outside than we are in our own home. If at work, in the office, in here, in the masjid, I show more rahmah to the people around me than when I go home, you've got it the wrong way around. So when we behave in private, different to when we behave in public, what does that refer to in Islam? Munafiq. It's hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy. And we know what Islam says about the hypocrites. If you find yourself acting differently outside the home to in the home, ask yourself why. Either you're doing it to show off outside because that's not the real you, or your understanding of your obligation to your family is misguided. Yeah? Those 4 relationships break down a bit further. Sorry, let's go back one. Well, you need to understand the beginning, right? So the beginning, Allah created Nabi Adam alayhi salam and Hawa, right? So from the very beginning, there was a man and a woman, right? And Islam's full of references to Allah creating men and women, that we are garments for each other, that we can't exist without each other. Just because Allah created men first doesn't make you better than the woman, right? The only thing that makes one person better than another in Islam is what? Is their iman, their piety. It is the only thing. It is the only distinction. We're all equal before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So remember what our beginning was, and remember that in the eyes of Allah, we are all equal. We need each other, right? Islam is not an individualist religion, right? Everything in our religion, in terms of this idea, is built around the family, right? The family unit, which is the father, the mother. That family unit is the basis of society, right? You have to, you can't get through as an individual in Islam, right? The next one is we have an obligation to remove harm. So even if removing a rock from the path is considered charity, how could bringing harm into your own home be okay? Surely the first place you should be removing harm is your own home, right? If you see something harmful on the road, it's an obligation on you to remove it. Surely your home should be the most safe place for your family. Enhancing good character, right? The Prophet, in terms of the house, was the most gentle, right? You look at the way he behaved with his wives. It's very different to the way he behaved with some of the Sahaba, right? With some of the Sahaba, he was very, very strict. He was very harsh with some of them. His family was the opposite, right? Gentleness and love was the essence of how he was in the household. And then this idea of servant leadership, which we've spoken about. All of those things are the way we should be behaving. These are the things we should be bringing into our own home. And if we do those and behave in terms of the way we said in terms of leadership, you can see that there's no way Islam says it's okay to be violent in the home. There's no justification for it at all. I'm not going to go through these. Leave those. In the last half hour or so, I want to go through some of these issues and then talk about masculinity. So these are some of the issues that came up in the survey, right? So around education, which we spoke about, I don't think there's need to cover that one. This issue of jobs, we spoke about, okay. One of the issues that we do have is this issue of employment. Can women work or can they not work? Does the husband have a right to deny his wife the right to work, right? At a general level, in the absence of anything else, I'm not going to ask the question, I'm just going to state it. A woman has the right to work in Islam. If anybody has a different view, I would encourage you to go back and ask someone, right? Who was the most respected woman in Islam? Khadija radiallahu anha, right? She was a businesswoman before she got married. She continued to be a businesswoman when she was married. It was her wealth that established this religion. Yeah, there is absolutely nothing in Islam that says a woman cannot work. Nothing. We move on. The woman's obligation in terms of the family is, without question, the family and the household. So this is where some of the tension happens between the men and women. Yeah? The man says, you don't have the right to work because you've got to look after the family. You can't say that. You can say your obligation, your starting obligation is the household, because it is. Islamically, the woman's first obligation is to care for the family and the household. If she can do that, and work, you as the husband have no say in that decision at all. You cannot stop her working if she is fulfilling her obligation to care for the family and the household. Particularly this day and age where you can work remotely, you can do online businesses, you can do a whole range of stuff. She doesn't even have to ask you permission to work if she is still fulfilling her obligation to the family and the household. But if you're in a situation where, as a family, what you want for you as a family, you can't do on one income, which is very common in this day and age. I would even suggest it's probably the most common situation that we're all in. You as the husband, by agreeing to that scenario where you agree as a couple that she'll work so that you can, buy a bigger house or you can get the things for the family, she is taking part of your burden. She's taking part of your obligation in Islam. If you then expect her to come back and do all of the things that she is obligated to do in the household, you're kidding yourself. How do you justify that? You can't be partnership on one part of that discussion, but then go back and say, no, I'm the leader of the household, you have to do everything in the house. It doesn't work that way. The Prophet didn't even do that in his own house, and his wife didn't work. as a couple, you come to these decisions together. If you want to be strict about, Islam says this is my, then fine, you take on the whole burden of the financial burden in its entirety, understand exactly what that means, right? And she will look after the household, and then she will work, provided she can do that, right? We need to move away from this idea, I'm the man, I have the absolute right in everything, particularly in this day and age, yeah? Because more and more the way technologies are happening, the more and more the ability of our women to do these things in situations which are Islamically okay without even us having an input into it, if we continue to go down this line that says rights and obligations, rather than as a family, let's have a discussion around what is the best for our family. Yeah. This issue around marital rape and intimacy. Both partners have a right to intimacy, not just the man, Islamically, right? Men, you have an obligation to fulfill the needs of your partners, Islamically, right? It is a right for a woman to divorce her husband if her needs are not being met. Don't get this thing into your head that this obligation works one way, right? No, we're all human beings. We all have needs. So the starting point isn't a man has a right to have his needs met. The starting position is both partners have a right to have their needs as people met. That's a starting position. Yes, there is that hadith that says a woman who denies her husband will be cursed by the angels. No question, it's there, right? So what I never do in these is say something's there's not there, right? Islam says that. But we are not the judges. It's not for us to then judge or force the situation. That hadith doesn't give you the right to force yourself. That hadith is a warning to the wife that she'll be judged between her and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on that. Because there are valid reasons why a woman can refuse. And she doesn't have to tell you all those reasons. There might be a whole range of reasons why she's not comfortable telling you. Outside of it's her period of the month. Right? There are health issues. There are a whole range of reasons why. Right? She doesn't have to tell you. It's between her and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What you cannot do is force yourself. Right? And there's an absolute prohibition in Islam on you doing something that she does not consent to. Right? Particularly in this day and age with pornography and a whole range of things that gets things into the minds of young men around what they can and can't do in the bedroom, right? Islam says very clearly there's some things which are forbidden, haram. But there are also some things which, while they're not haram, remember the situation we're talking about here, right? If you're forcing someone to do something they're not comfortable with, what does that say? That's not the essence of a healthy relationship, that you're forcing someone to do something they're not comfortable with. Yeah? I know this topic is not a comfortable one for people to talk about, right? But it's an important one. This idea about keeping track and spying, we spoke about that, so I don't think I need to go through it, other than to say, again, Islamically, yes, the husband has a right to know if the wife's leaving, and in certain cases to deny her permission to go, right? That is undeniably a position within Islam, right? So women, so these are some issues that our sisters need to get around their heads as well, yeah? It's part of the roles. But if the husband's doing that role in the way we've spoken about, then why would you just deny her for the sake of denying her? But men do, right? There's no question some men deny for no reason other than he just wants to prove a point. I just want to prove that I'm in control. So I'm going to say, no, you can't go. But if you allow her to go do the shopping and you allow her to go do this and do that, and then you say no to her go visiting her friend or go visiting her family, then why? Where's the justice? Where's the rahmah in that? You're just being arbitrary. This is oppression, right? You have to be consistent in how you do these things, right? Financial dependence we've spoken about, social, we've spoken about most of these now. All right. masculinity. And this is where we're going to compare Western concepts of masculinity to what Islam says. So these slides, you'll see they look a bit different. These are not my slides. These are the slides from Our Watch, that government organisation, because I'm using them to show what they say as I have a conversation about some of these issues, yeah? So out there, this is what they say, right? Current research shows the strongest between masculinity and violence against women. So what they're trying to do is convince young men and boys to accept their version of what it means to be a man. And if you do that, then you'll reduce violence. So they're saying the way in which historically you've grown up as being a man is part of the problem, right? That's their position, right? That's what they say. They say it's a social construction, which means society says what a man is. And so society can change its mind at any time about what a man is, right? So we're now saying a man is this, so you should be this, right? It intersects with other aspects of identity in social locations such as race, class, and sexuality, right? So they link this all together, right? So what they say, these are the things which they say are problem parts of masculinity. Being aggressive, being in control, toughness, stoicism means, suck it up, that sort of thing. Compulsory heterosexuality, right? They say is a problem in that form of masculinity, right? These are things which are a problem. Let's not worry too much about that one. All right. They then did this study called the Man Box, right? And it looks at the attitudes and behaviours of young Australian men, right? And based on how they answered certain questions, they were either in the Man Box or they were outside the Man Box. And the Man Box is not a good place to be in from their perspective. It's people who demonstrate all those characteristics of bad masculinity, right? So let's go through some of them. Perpetrated physical bullying in the past month. If you're 47% of people in the Man Box, bullied people, right? Made sexual comments to women you don't know in a public place, 46% were there. Went along or didn't take action when witnessing guys making sexist comments, jokes. Now, we don't have an issue with those things. We would not, as Muslims, condone any of that, yeah? But what we would say is those things are consistent with what it means to be a man from a Muslim perspective, right? We don't have to compromise our masculinity to behave in this way. I just want to go to the next one. Right. So what do you then do? So this is their approach to this, right? Challenge essentialist ideas of men and masculinity. So what they say is to prevent violence, you've got to challenge ideas of masculinity. You've got to challenge how men see themselves. So 28% of men agreed with the statement in their survey. When a man is sexually aroused, he may not even realise that the woman doesn't want to have sex. And 30% of men agree with the statement. Rape results from men not being able to control their need for sex, right? So what they're saying is you've got to change how men see themselves to change these things. Now, we would say, no, men, you just need to understand the only person you can have an intimate relationship with is your wife, and she has obligations on you, right? Don't go out. Right? Don't go out. You don't have boyfriends. You don't have girlfriends, right? Society changed your approach to sexuality and gender relations, and this isn't an issue, right? Then they say encourage understandings of sex and gender that are non-binary driven. So what they're saying is you have to accept this idea that sexuality is fluid. And if you're a man who denies that, then you are in the Man Box, and that's not a good way of being a man. So when we go out and say, no, there's really only men and women, it's the gender and sexuality Allah gave us, and we don't accept LGBTQI positions, that, according to them, that automatically puts us in a situation where we are in the wrong box. Yeah? But we have to do that. We do not share that view. And we have to be able to show that holding what we would call traditional orthodox positions within the faith around sexuality and gender is absolutely consistent with being not violent towards women and children. Address dominant norms, structures, and practices of masculinity aimed to be gender transformative. You can see this issue of gender just comes into every single aspect of this. Yeah. Promote positive male and peer relationships, no issues with that. Maintain accountability to women. Work in consultation with women's organisations, listen to women. That's fine. No issues with that. Provided your basis is our Islamic principles, right? We can't afford to water down what Islam says on these issues. We don't need to. Islam has enough in it to justify how we behave towards each other without having to water down what Allah SWT already tells us our roles are as men and women. I'm thinking that probably, I know it's a little bit early, but I'm thinking it's probably not a bad place to stop and maybe just open it up for questions. And cause what time do we pray the Dhuhr here? So it's probably a good time, I think. I've covered the main points. I guess the only last thing, maybe I guess a closing comment, and then we can open up for questions and see if there's anybody online who wants to ask a question. Is this on the issue? This last one is issue of gender. Sorry, no. There's one more thing I should cover. Sorry, I do want to cover this issue of Surah An-Nisa, right? It is the one thing which non-Muslims repeatedly throw in our face, that there's a verse in the Quran that gives the man the right to beat his wife, right? And our younger people in particular struggle with this verse because they don't know how to respond, right? Because intuitively, as human beings, we're sympathetic to someone who says nobody has a right to be violent towards someone else, right? So I'm not a alim, I'm not a sheikh. I'm going to give you how I respond to this issue with non-Muslims first, right? They pull out one word out of this ayah, the word daraba, right, in Arabic. They pull out one word and say that word, of course, they don't know Arabic, so they say it's translated as strike or beat. They ignore everything else, right? So it's one word in one ayah. There are about 6,500 ayahs in the Quran, right? So it's one word out of 6,500 ayahs of the Quran. In addition to the Quran, our other main primary source is what is the hadith, right? If you look at all the 6 sahihs and you look at all the different transmission, there's about 4,500 unique hadith in the 6 sahih collections. So if you take those 4,500 and the 6,500 ayahs, there's about 11,000 primary source texts that our fiqh is derived from. And they take one word out of 11,000 paragraphs and they want to, I say, you know what, when you can come have a conversation about the whole 11,000 and understand the context of this in all of that, then we'll have a conversation about it. Otherwise, I don't care. I'm comfortable with that Islam says there's no condoning of violence in marriage, right? They said, but this is what it says. So, well, yeah, but you don't understand the whole context of it. When I have a conversation internally, this is the way I respond to this, right? We never ever, my advice, we never ever deny the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't allow non-Muslims to take us down the path where we try to justify what the word is. The word is what it is. It's there, right? Part of our Aqidah is we believe the Quran is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't change the Quran, unlike other faiths, right? The Bible today is not the Bible that was revealed to Isa alayhi salam. It was created 300-400 years after his death, right? The word is the word. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all-knowing. He knew everything before anything was ever created. We don't understand why everything is there, and we will never understand why everything is there, but we accept that it is there. But let's have a look at this, what the ayah is. You can't just look at that word. You have to look at the whole ayah to start with. And the main part of that is at the very beginning of the ayah, when it talks about men you are guardians, it uses the word kawamun, which is used elsewhere in the Quran. What does that word come from, right? So the whole concept of that word means to stand up against oppression and injustice. So that ayah starts off by saying to the men, you are people who stand up against oppression and injustice. Everything that comes after that is in that context. So I don't care whether you're someone who takes the translation of that word as being something from beating to something of nothing worse than striking with a miswak. I don't care. That can be whatever it was. It's still in the context that you have to be someone who stands up against oppression and injustice, right? Starting point. The second part of it is, the ayah itself has a context. It doesn't give men unfettered right to strike, beat their wife, however you want to understand that word. It's in the context of nushuz. It says when there's a case of nushuz. What does nushuz mean? I'm not even going to try and translate it because, again, it goes from as little as some people say it can be as simple as disobedience. At the other end of the extreme, it is adultery. So this is within traditional fiqh. It goes from this end to this end. Doesn't matter in this context because from my perspective, given everything else, the Quran and the Hadith, Allah and the Prophet ﷺ tell us about marriage, around the essence of marriage being rahmah and mercy, and that you are garments for each other, you're meant to protect. Surely it cannot be as simple as, I don't agree with what you're saying, it gives you the right to strike. That's my view. It can't be that. It has something a bit more than that. The shoes is something a bit more than that, right? Because then look at what Allah says. He says, in that context, to the man, you can then do this. If this doesn't work, you can do this. If it doesn't work, then you can do this, right? It's an escalation. So there's clearly a breakdown in the marriage relationship of some sort. It's not just a petty thing. There's some serious issue here. And I was giving you some advice, right? If you can't resolve it, then do this. If you can't resolve it, then do this. And if you can't resolve it, then you can do this. It's not an obligation. It doesn't say to the man, you shall do this, or you must do this, right? It's an option. It's a choice we men have. And whenever we're faced with choices, the first thing we look at what the purpose of that revelation is. The purpose of this ayah is very clear. It's about resolving marital differences. Yeah. So in this day and age, so this is the challenge I put to the men in our community. In this day and age, I don't care how you translate, how you interpret it, your understanding of the verse. In this day and age, if you can honestly look yourself in the mirror and say, the best way to resolve your marital difference is by striking your wife, even with as little strike as a miswak, you're kidding yourself. You're absolutely kidding yourself if you think that will resolve your marital difference. And if it doesn't resolve the marital difference, then your reasons for using that ayah to justify you striking her, from my perspective, is invalid. Because it goes against what the purpose of the ayah is. So I don't care how you interpret any way you like. I'm not challenging the interpretation. It's there. But there's a context to it. There's a purpose behind it. So then people say, particularly non say, well, then why is it even there? Well, because Allah tells us, today I've perfected your religion forever, which means Islam has in it principles that apply in every time, in every context, no matter what. When the Quran was first revealed, when Islam first came, I have no doubt that this ayah saved women's lives. No doubt whatsoever, it saved women's lives. And when I look around the world today, it doesn't take much for me to think of a scenario where there are some countries which might break down socially so much that this area may very well save women's lives again in the future. Right? When you look at what's happening in some countries, even in America, right? There's some parts of America where if you're a woman, it is not safe for you to go outside at night, right? Allahu Alam. There might very well come another time where this ayah will save women's lives. But I don't have to justify it. I don't have to justify it. All I have to do is say, in my time and my place, what is the purpose of... Am I muted, am I? Okay, sorry. All I have to say is, in my time and my place, what is the application of this ayah? And if it's about solving marital disputes, then no, I'm not going to take those options because it's not going to achieve the outcome, right? We don't have to have the conversations that non-Muslims want to make us have, right? We have to take ownership of this narrative back, right? Don't force them to force us to have this. I don't want to have a conversation. I don't have to justify. I present to non-Muslims in the domestic violence sector a lot. And I start my presentation this way, and I'll finish with this comment. I say because remember, in this industry, it's mostly women, and it has a very high representation of LGBTQI people. So I say, most of you in this room are going to ignore anything I'm about to say. No, of course not. So absolutely, I'll tell you why. First of all, I'm a man. And historically in this industry, women, you've discounted anything men have to say because we're the problem. You don't see us as part of the solution. So I'm a man. Not only am I a man, I'm a brown man. And most of the women in this sector are white women. Right? So I'm a brown man. So straight away, even though you realise, even though you don't intend it, you have unconscious biases. So I'm a man and I'm a brown man. Not only am I a brown man, I'm a brown man who believes in God. Right? And you, most of you, think I'm an idiot for basing my values on divine revelation. So you're going to discount what I say. Not only am I a man who believes in God, I'm actually someone who believes in a particular version of God, Islam, that you already see as violent. Right? For the last 30 years, the only thing you have been shown about me is I'm someone who's prone to violence. So you already, as women in this sector, have a predisposition to think that men can be violent, that our way of solving issues is violence. You have a greater view that migrant men, brown men, are more prone to violence than white men, right? The research is there, right? You have a greater view that people of faith have positions which lead to violence, and you have an even greater view that men of the Muslim faith are even more violent than anybody else. So I'm telling you, 9% of you are just going to discount anything I have to say. But you know what? I don't care. I don't care, because you are not going to be able to come into my community and solve this problem. My community can figure out the way to solve this problem with the values it has. We don't need you to come and solve the problem. We need you to give us space to solve it for ourselves. Don't come into our community and impose your views of the world. It won't work, right? If I was to go into my community and the first thing I say to them is, you have to accept this view of gender, if I'm allowed to stay in the room, people are just going to shut off and not listen to anything I have to say anyway, right? The message we have to give out to the non-Muslim community is, we don't need your permission. We don't need you to give us permission to use our own values and our own religion to solve this issue. We actually need you just to leave us alone and we'll do it. Give us the space to do it. But that means we need to learn. We need to know. We need to go through all this stuff. We need to have these conversations, because it does happen. We can't kid ourselves, it doesn't happen. It happens. Right? So I will stop there. Questions, comments?
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Silahkan, if anyone has any questions, for those who are following the workshop online through Zoom, or for men and women in this room, silahkan. Dan pertanyaan dari ibu-ibu dulu, ladies, if you have any questions, silahkan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, brother, for your sharing your knowledge. I just would like to ask if there is anyone who would like to help you in this movement. How can we, participate and take part in it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So inshallah, obviously, the more we can have these conversations, the better. The next part of what we're going to do is we want to do things at a local level. So what I don't want to come in and impose on your community what you should do, right? That'd be no different to what I'm saying. We want to stop the West from doing, right? So our role here is to help you figure out what would work for your community, because every community is different, right? So there are opportunities coming up where we can provide some support, some guidance, some mentoring if you want to do things for your own community, whether it is more of these sort of talks, a project of some sort. I would encourage you to put together a small, committee of people who have an interest in this, and we can explore some things that you would work for your community, I think. I've just put into the Zoom chat the link to the feedback survey as well. If as many people could fill that in, that would be good, please. It only takes 2 or 3 minutes to fill out. So even while you're sitting there now, you can fill it out. Any other questions? Is there anything that anybody would want me to explain? We'll talk about more of. It's okay if you don't agree, right? This isn't, you don't have to agree with everything I've said.
Bapak-bapak, anyone from the men? Zoom? Ada ya? Silakan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Jazakallah khairan, brother, for the sharing, mashallah. This is what we need because as we all know, we born, raised in our motherland. Perspective is very, very different. And we here has to learn, like it or not, about this because the challenge is different. The challenge from Prophet's time also different. So I think 2 questions, please. Has in the Prophet's time, in Prophet Rasulullah time, has things like this occurred? And because I think we know about Prophet Lut, the sodomy case and everything, but probably we haven't heard the case during Rasulullah Muhammad time. I haven't encountered such as. Secondly, I think Brother Danny before raised about our children, because like our kids born raised in Western country, and totally different perspective. So first the parents have to learn, and I don't know. Do you have tips, simple tips at home? You mentioned about dinner talk about this. For start, it's very hard to bring kids to the table. So just a simple tips, 2 or 3 as a takeaway for myself, maybe more.
Sure.
How actually is the range from kids that maybe these kids 5 years old to the teenagers. I think the youth adult, they already like perhaps gone, but like the spectrum from say like 7 years younger or maybe 10 years older. So tips and for us a simple one.
Sure. In terms of examples during the time of the Prophet, in terms of domestic violence, so I'll go 2. So there are absolute cases, recorded cases where domestic violence was brought to the Prophet where he forced the Sahaba to divorce his wife because it wasn't safe for her to remain in that relationship. Right? So he divorced them because he's not going to leave her in a relationship where she's being abused. Right? In terms of the general issue around gender and sexuality, for example, these are in traditional books of fiqh. Right? There were cases during the time of the Prophet where he described 2 categories of people: men whose general nature is effeminate, so they weren't putting on an act; it was just the way they were. And he basically said, "That's who they are. They're not doing anything wrong." And then there are people who put on the appearance, the airs of being effeminate. And they're the ones that he said, no, this is haram, right? You're a man, you have to be a man. So even at the time of Prophet, he recognized that our attitude sometimes may not align with the gender we're born with. It didn't change the rulings, didn't change you whether you're a man or you're a woman, but your obligation around how you behave has to be looked at. And the way in which the community sees you has to reflect those differences, right? So he's saying there are absolutely people whose just general nature is either, if they're a man, more effeminate, if they're a bit more masculine. That's just the way they are. They're not doing anything. That's just who they are. And you accept that's who they are. But then there are people who, which align a little bit more to what we have today, who force that on themselves. So if they don't do it, it wouldn't be their natural inclination. And so, no, this is not correct. That's not how Allah made you. You behave the way Allah created you. So not at the time of the Prophet, but after, there are, in the text, there's plenty of discussion around issues of gender and sexuality and the changing of gender, because Islam dealt with individuals who were born either with no sexual organs or bisexual organs well before the Western world did. So our jurists dealt with this issue of, well, what if I feel different to what my gender is, or I don't know what my gender is? So there's a lot of that discussion in our books of fiqh around what is permissible, what is not permissible. It's all there if we know where to look for it. But I think what we've got to do, and this leads into, I guess, the second one, is we really need to just pare a lot of this down to some really simple concepts. And we need to really teach our children, and we start as early as we can, to really understand what it means to believe in a creator and what that means for you as a creation. Because our biggest challenge in navigating this dual identity of being Muslim and being in a Western country is this pressure in a Western context around the individual being supreme. You're an individual. As long as you're not hurting anybody, you can do whatever you want. Not only can you should. It's like, in fact, that's what freedom is. Do whatever you want. No, that's anarchy. That's chaos, right? We need to have those conversations as early as we can in a way which is meaningful to those different ages. So you don't have the same conversation with a 5-year-old as you would have with a 15, 16-year-old, yeah? But you do it in a way which actually gets the same message across, right? If you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you believe that you are a creation, that has consequences for the way in which you behave and the things that you believe and accept. We need to get our children to accept that basic relationship as early as possible, so that when they start to have to deal with these issues, they've got this foundation that says, you know what, I understand that, but all of that ignores one thing. It ignores the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if I put that in terms of the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, well, it changes things, right? If I really believe that Allah exists, how can I possibly believe that someone was born with the wrong gender? I mean, it makes no sense, right? Logically, it makes no sense. You can't believe in a divine, all-knowing, all-powerful being who then mistakenly creates you as a male or a female. Right? Makes no sense. But if you don't have that concept, if you don't have that, then it makes a lot of sense to say, well, it's just an accident of nature. What gender I am, it's chromosomes, right? Just an accident of nature. Really, it's just how I feel, which is what Western society is going down the line. So we've got to do better at having those sorts of conversations as early as we can, which means we've got to build learning, education, and what we call pedagogy, which is the way in which we teach, so that we can get those really difficult concepts across to different age groups in an appropriate way. So the example you use with a small child is going to be different to a 10-year-old to a 16-year-old. But you can still do it. You can have storybooks. They get the same message across to a 5-year-old, and then you change the way you engage as they get older. But if we don't start to tackle those, we're going to lose generations, right? If we do that, it gives parents something that they can actually then have a conversation about. My view is the biggest challenge for parents is we haven't given parents the knowledge and the resources to use to have those conversations. Because back in our cultures, when you're Muslim, you don't have to have them. The government has it at an institutional level. They're not faced. That's changing, right? With the internet and technology, doesn't really matter these days where you are. As a parent, you're going to be faced with these issues because they're everywhere now, right? So I think as a community, we need to give parents more access to information which is appropriate, that gets these sort of really core messages across, that focuses on our iman, right? Our belief. It's really easy to teach someone how to pray. But if you can teach someone why they pray in terms of their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that belief in their heart goes into a whole range of other things, not just the solid. They go a whole range of other things. So I think as a community, we need to revisit what we teach, how we teach it, what information we give parents to have these conversations, right? And we've got to do it early. It's too late by the time they're 15, 16, because the Western society is pushing this stuff much earlier, right? So they're doing what's called consent education. So there are laws now around consent in terms of rape and sexual assault, right? That boys in particular have to understand when a girl means yes and when she means no, right? Now, from our perspective, as a society, just don't interact in that way and you solve half the problem. But that's not the context we're in, right? So they're teaching children what it means to consent and not consent. But in a lot of that, subliminally, you have a lot of this gender stuff coming through, right? But they're doing it as early learning centres. So they have material where they're teaching very young, like we're talking 3-4-year-olds, while they don't use the language, they're introducing them to concepts which will then build on over the years, which affirms this Western concept of sexuality being a social construct and that it's fluid and it's whatever you want and everyone has a right to and you shouldn't say no and all those sorts of things. So we've got to replicate that. We've got to do that ourselves from as early as possible coming through.
The last 3 questions is online, Brother Gain.
Homeschooling is the first one. I don't have a view particularly about homeschooling per se. I think you've got to find the way which works for your child, right? In the level context, and absolutely for some children, homeschooling is the best option. My general advice to parents is do not fall in a situation where you're relying on a school, even an Islamic school, to be dealing with these issues, right? They can't. They are bound to teach a certain curriculum. And while they have Islamic studies and a whole range of stuff, there are so many eyes watching them that really for them to have the conversations that we've just had, near impossible. Right? So as parents, we have to come back and own the fact that at the end of the day, we are responsible for the education of our children. Our schools will do part, but we have to do part of that. And if that means homeschooling in entirety, then you go down the homeschooling path. If that means finding a madrasa or doing it yourself to cover some parts of this, then you need to do that as well. But don't think just because your children go into an Islamic school that you have to worry about these issues, right? I can tell you some stories, right, which I've had to deal with of children, youth, going to Islamic school who've ended up in situations and stuff where if the parents knew that they would have heart attacks, right? Don't kid yourself. But it's an Islamic school, things don't happen, yeah? On the second one, I think the main point of the second one is role modeling in the house, right? Your children will do the things that they see their parents doing. So if the parents are fighting, if the way in which the father resolves differences is by, being I'm the man and you do as I say, that's the behavior that young boys will pick up. But it's also the behavior that young girls will think is actually the right way of doing things, right? So my best advice is as a couple, you need to role model what you want to teach your children. That's not easy because we're humans. We have emotions and we struggle, right? But they'll mimic what you're doing. So role model the best behavior, which means you learn And then as they get older, you start having some conversations. So remember, the Prophet ﷺ told us the way we teach is in 3 stages. From 0 to 7, there's a particular way that we teach. From 7, not 14, but about 12 is a particular way we teach. And then we go again. As parents, we have to transition the way we engage with our children, right? You know, I don't have the same conversation with a 15, 16-year-old as I would with a 5, 6-year-old. While that person is still under my guardianship, right? If I'm having to resort to, I'm your father, you have to do what I say, to a 15, 6-year-old, I've lost it already, right? It doesn't matter how much I say, I'm your father, you have to do what I say. A 15, 16-year-old is going to do what they want to do. They'll find the way of doing what they want to do. To start to learn, I guess, the way in which the Prophet told us to teach and engage with our children. But also remember that it comes a point where we have to start transitioning while we still have some influence over them, to allow them to start practicing making decisions for themselves. And that's always a hard thing as a parent to do, where you can still make that decision, but you then choose not to, and allow your child to make a decision while they're still within the safety of your environment, where if you need to, you can support and pick up the pieces, right? But if you don't teach your children to start doing that, how are they going to be able to do that when they get older, when they get married? If you don't allow them to take responsibility for making life decisions until after they get married, on what basis are they going to actually make those decisions when they're married? How are they going to do that, right? Decisions around what I'm going to study, where I'm going to work, what I'm not going to work, am I going to buy a car, I'm not going to buy a car. I know as a parent, right? I don't do that. I don't want to, because of X, Y, Z, right? But at some point, I've got to be able to say, okay, you talk me through it. Tell me why you want to do what you want to do, right? Let's have a conversation about it. And there might be situations where, as long as the harm isn't going to be too great, where I think, you know what, this is not a good decision, but I'm going to let it go. I'm going to because sometimes people just have to learn the hard way, right? That's a real challenge as a parent, knowing where those transition points are when you start to shift, because there's no hard and fast rule. Children evolve and mature at different stages and different ages. That means sometimes you might do things differently with one child to another child. You know, how often as parents you hear one child say, but you treated so differently? Well, actually, yeah, I did. It was a different context. They're a different person to you. We were in a different situation, a whole range of things of that sort. So role model, go back and look into the way in which the Seerah talks about parenting, and really reflect on when you can start to help your children really maneuver their own way, so that when they are responsible for themselves, they've at least had a go at, making some of those decisions. A bit like driving a car, right? You sit in the passenger seat with them for a while. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to run up the gutter occasionally. Occasionally they will have an accident, right? But you're there to help them, so that when they're out there on their own, you've got some confidence that they're not going to kill someone on the road. Yeah. If we look at yours, how do we identify if the person a future partner? Allah Alam, right? Really, that's a hard one, because what you see is not always what you get, right? So we fall back on what are the things the Prophet told us to do when we're looking for partners generally, right? And our starting position is always, don't look at the individual, look at the family, right? Look at the parents, right? How the parents are, forget anything you're told. How the parents behave to each other is how their children are going to assume is the right way to behave. So if you visit them and the father yells or belittles his wife, right, that is how his son's going to behave. I guarantee you, right? Not everyone, there will be some men who find their own path through, but they're the sort of red signs you look for, right? Because you don't know the individual life, and we don't have in Islam this idea of getting to know each other, right? This is not Islamic. We don't have boyfriends, girlfriends. We don't have getting to know each other, right? We have other criteria for finding partners, right? So look at the family. Look at how they behave when no one's watching. How the young person behaves when no one's around. They're going to be on their absolute best behavior when they're in front of you. right? Look at the other things to get an indication of, and they're not going to be violent necessarily, but look at, how quickly they might snap, or do they actually listen to advice? They ask. They're the sort of things you look for in the family and the people around them, child.
Jazakallah khair, Delegate. I think it's because it's time for Zuhr prayer, so we're gonna end this session of this workshop today. But it's been very good for, I think, everyone who are attending today. Brother Gate himself is from an organization called Muslim Women Australia. He's the project leader of an initiative called FACE. FACE stands for Faith and Cultural Empowerment. So he leads this project. He goes around to the communities, to the mosques, and for those community who would like to listen more on or having some sort of training from him, he would be happy to do so. Inshallah, this will be the first session that we have, and we have other centers in the southeast, in Coburg, in the north, who may be interested in doing such a workshop or session. Thank you once again, Brother Gate, for your time and the sharing of your knowledge and presentation that you have done today for us. And inshallah, this will be beneficial to all of us, and Allah will give us the barakah. And we learn a lot from what we have today. From the Indonesian Muslim community of Victoria, we would like to thank you and your family as well, and the work that you have done for the Muslim community, for the Ummah in Victoria. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Kita tutup dengan doa kafaratul majelis. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika asyhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Mari kita siap-siap untuk sholat zuhur.